Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to ACS Spring Meeting 2024. I want to extend a special welcome to folks who are joining us online. A very warm invitation to join the conversation today from an unseasonably cool New Orleans. My name is Nick Ishmael Perkins, and I am the editor-in-chief at C&EN. And some of you may know that I have started quite recently. And when we were discussing my start date, they said, well, you could come to New Orleans and speak to the Nobel Laureate. And I was like, oh my gosh, this gig just keeps getting better. So I'm really delighted with what we're planning for the next hour. And I have here with me our 2024 Priestley Medal Award recipient, Carolyn Bertozzi. Caroline is the Anne and Robert Bass Professor of Chemistry at Stanford University and the Baker Family Director of the Stanford Sarafan ChemH Research Center. She is a Howard Hughes Medical Institute investigator and, of course, the recipient of the Nobel Prize of Chemistry in 2022. Yeah. That prize and a long list of others recognize her role in the invention of bioorthogonal click chemistry. She is a founder or co-founder of 13 companies, most of which aim to advance discoveries made in her lab into therapies and diagnostics. She is an elected member of the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Medicine, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. The Priestley Medal is her 5th major award from ACS. I'm genuinely excited to be speaking to you today, Caroline. And I want to start by asking you the question which is foremost in everyone's mind here, which is, what was it like to play with Tom Morello? I mean, seriously. I mean, the thing is, we know that actually Barry Sharpless is also Nobel Laureate, and he plays the guitar. And is there a connection between music and chemistry that we're missing?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for hosting this Fireside Chat, and also welcome to C&E News. It's wonderful to have you with ACS Publications.
Thank you.
So I think playing with Tom Morello might be my biggest of all claims to fame. It's turning out to be that way, at least. So for those of you who don't know, Tom is a very famous rock musician who formed a band called Rage Against the Machine in the 1990s, and then later another band called Audio Slave. And he still plays, he tours with Rage now still, and he plays with the E Street Band with Bruce Springsteen. And anyways, but when he was a college student, at the age of 19, he formed a band, and I happened to be 2 years behind him at the same college, and he recruited me to join the band as the keyboard player. So for 1 year in college, I played in a band with a guy who later became famous. And that apparently is my biggest claim to fame. But it was amazing because he was and is an amazing musician. He was way ahead of his time in the way that he performed on the guitar and the way that he used digital interfaces, right, to create sort of guitar effects, which in the 1980s was kind of a new thing. And then what about chemists and music? Yeah. I mean, I think, first of all, music is a universal language, and you don't have to be a chemist to be a musician. Anybody can enjoy music and should.
Okay. So I want to talk a bit about your career as a mentor for scientists. And I know that you've said that actually supporting your students is at the heart of what you do, which is a pretty extraordinary thing, to have had the kind of breakthroughs that you've had in your career and still to put such a focus on what might be seen as such a pastoral role. I mean, do you want to reflect a bit on how you keep that balance? Is it a balance? Does it feel like an effort to keep that balance?
It's a really good question. And I do think sometimes people think that somehow teaching, training, mentoring is in conflict with research. But in fact, that's not true at all. It's the opposite. So I think in order to be a successful academic researcher, you really have to be someone who invests in teaching, training, and mentoring, because in academia, our workforce are trainees, right? So my workforce is mostly students and then postdoctoral fellows and some undergraduates, but they're all young, very early career scientists who are in a training stage. And that is my entire workforce, right? So if I don't invest in those people the way that they need me to, right, in their training years, I don't have a research program. They're one and the same.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's a really interesting framing, because that then also raises some questions about how you go about selecting your trainees, as you call it, as a workforce. And I mean, because you're quite dependent, of course, and that comes with some risk. I mean, how do you balance that?
Well, so first of all, the trainees more often are choosing me rather than me choosing them, right? At a university, your students apply to a program and they're admitted to the program, and then they have their choice of labs that they can work in within that program. And there's dozens of faculty they could choose from, and I'm so fortunate when occasionally they choose me. So that's usually the dynamic. So with that, I'll say that. But then the other thing is, what was the second part of the question?
Well, I was asking, because, do you find there's a trade-off with trying to manage the risk that's associated with being dependent on the trainees? And
Yes, it's a good question, because this is one of the big differences between the experience of an academic researcher versus a researcher in a company, an industrial researcher, or a researcher in an institute or a government lab, right? In academia, because our workforce are largely young, relatively inexperienced trainees, we do have to make a bigger investment in their sort of ramp up from 0 to 60. Whereas in a company, they're professionals, they're coming in at 60, right? And so that brings some challenges with it, because my workforce is always inexperienced. And just when a person becomes experienced, competent, expert, they leave, right? And then I get a new bunch that are inexperienced all over again. So that means that, I do have to be understanding and patient with people who are on the learning curve, which most of them are. On the flip side, one of the benefits from being on a learning curve is that you're not tainted with the dogma of a field. And scientific disciplines are always plagued with dogma. And often where the magic happens is just outside of that dogma, right? People who can kind of think outside of the norms of a field, who are not confined by assumptions that everyone in a field might have. Mm-hmm. Those people often have the breakthrough ideas because they're just clueless enough that they don't know that everyone else thinks they're crazy, So that's actually a benefit of academia. You get young people who are not, already inculcated with the doctrine, and so they're very open-minded, and they'll try risky things that sometimes really pay off big.
I mean, it's interesting because, chemical biology has this reputation for working with people who have training in other areas, and what you've done is to make a really compelling case for why, in fact, more fields should probably be working, with folks at the boundaries. I want to talk a little bit about, your own experience with mentorship, because, your postgrad, you finished your postgrad degree without a supervisor. You said that was actually really challenging, but it was also an opportunity. Do you want to say a little bit about that, how it might have shaped your approach to mentorship?
Yes, so you're referring to my experience as a PhD student. And what happened to me was I joined the PhD program at UC Berkeley in chemistry. And I joined the lab of a brand new assistant professor who had just arrived at the same time I did. So he recruited a handful of us students to his lab, and there we were, getting the lab up and running and off the ground and set up and getting new projects to try and get some traction. And 3 years into it, he became ill and was diagnosed with colon cancer. And he was quite young. I mean, he was 33 years old at the time. So this is a very unusual diagnosis for someone his age. And it was an aggressive form of colon cancer. And so he ended up taking a leave of absence, and then ultimately he decided to quit his job. And he had this epiphany about his life and how he wanted to work with cancer patients, and he wanted to be a doctor. So he spent a year being treated, having chemotherapy and so on. And then he quit and went to medical school. And this all started at the end of my third year of my PhD program. So for the last 2 years or so, when I was finishing my graduate work, he was gone. And in fact, in my very last year, he was a first-year med student at Stanford at the time. And so myself and a couple of other students who were like my classmates, you know how grad students, you remember how nothing really works until the end of your third year? And all of a sudden you start to get some traction. That's when I would have had to switch to another lab. And I mean, this would have been devastating because finally my project was working, And so the bunch of us went to the department chair and pleaded, please let us just finish our research projects without a supervisor, because we didn't want to start all over again in another lab. And this was back in 1991 or something like that. I think it was a little bit more laissez-faire back then. And the department chair at Berkeley at the time said, all right. So there we were, the three of us, and we just had no boss, and we just kind of ran our own lab. And on the one hand, that's a challenge, you can imagine. I mean, a graduate supervisor should serve some function, But on the other hand, in hindsight, it was trial by fire, and we learned how to be independent, and we learned how to manage our own research program and run the lab. We even applied for grant renewals. We forged his signature on everything. And in fact, I was submitting papers. I wanted to publish my papers finally, and I remember submitting a paper to JAX, and the reviewers shredded it, and I was, and I showed some friends of mine in another lab the reviews from my paper, and they said, oh well, when this happens to us, our boss gets on the phone and complains to the editor-in-chief. And I said, well, all right, I don't have a boss, so I guess I'll just do it. So I called Alan Bard at the time, was the editor-in-chief, to complain about reviewer number 3, And he was like, who are you? So that's the kind of stuff that we had to do. And it was not always successful, but when I went a few years later back to Berkeley and started my own lab, I became an assistant professor in that same department a few years after this. And I kind of knew what to do because of that experience.
I mean, I'm laughing because I'm thinking it's a little bit like that moment in Pretty Woman where it's like, big mistake.
Maybe.
But you said something actually I thought was very interesting. You said, back then it was a little more laissez-faire. I mean, do you think it would be impossible to do that now, to be able to finish without a supervisor?
I can't speak for every institution, but I do know that at my current institution, which is Stanford, and also at Berkeley when I left 10 years ago, I don't think anybody would leave 3 grad students unattended to do a PhD thesis. First of all, safety concerns, liability issues. I mean, that just wouldn't happen. It's good and bad, more good than bad, I think.
So I have one more question about your role as a mentor. There is a great quote in the article about where your students say that it's a bit like they're walking in 6-foot-high grass and you're flying above in a propeller airplane. What's the view like up there? I mean, are you looking ahead? Are you looking down? Are you looking back? Are you looking at pattern?
Okay, so Jeremy Baskin said that. He was a former grad student of mine who's now a professor, a tenured professor at Cornell, okay? So I didn't know that he felt that way because usually the way I feel with the students and postdocs in my lab is usually that they're the ones up in the plane with a 360-degree view, all-knowing, all-wise, all-powerful. And I'm the one who's below just like chasing after them, trying to catch up, with the shadow, trying to keep with it. That's how I feel. And the reason I feel that way is because, I'm always encouraging them to try new things, to break into new areas, to figure out what we can do, and apply our chemical tools and our chemical know-how to new problems. And then they go all in on that problem and they eat, sleep, and breathe it. Whereas I don't have the bandwidth to do that for every new project we try to kickstart, right? So usually it's me who's learning from them and hopefully asking good questions that prompt them to sort of go to the next level of their understanding. So I'm surprised to hear him say that about me. The only thing I can say is if I have a broader view than the trainees in my lab, it's simply because I'm just old. And the older you get, the more experience you get, the more understanding you have, and the more you can see and anticipate. But that's not a function of a different brain. It's just a function of an older brain, really.
I mean, that's a very nice endorsement for growing old, folks.
Yeah.
So you've said that, now just kind of shifting away from mentorship and sort of talking more generally about, working in labs, that relationships are the key to success in science and chemistry. Do you want to just break that down for us a little bit?
Well, science is a human endeavor, right? It's practiced by humans. Humans are a social species, and a lot of what we do is governed by our social relationships. There are very few things that humanity does solo. Most of us, everything that humanity accomplishes is usually accomplished at the level of families, communities. There's a social structure, and science is incredibly social. And it's funny because if you think about the reputation that we have outside of science in the world at large, on TV and in movies, people think that we're freakish little trolls that live in the basement and all unto ourselves with no friends, and nothing could be further from the truth, because you really can't be a successful scientist if you're hiding in your basement. I mean, that's impossible. So I do think that the most exciting moments in my scientific career have come from teams of people with close relationships, like bouncing ideas off each other, being each other's inspiration and muse, and also being each other's support and cheerleaders, right? All of this is important to succeed in science.
I mean, and it's interesting because I do think that your career is marked by some really interesting collaborations. It's clearly something that you value a lot. But I mean, it's also interesting to reflect on your career and all of the accolades that you have, and we see this in various structures. Do you still feel like actually we have institutions, and I would also include the media in this instinct to find a hero scientist? Like we don't kind of give awards to teams so much as we do to individuals.
That's absolutely true, and there's no better representation of that than the Nobel Prize, right? So Nobel Prizes are given to individuals, and no more than 3 for areas of science, right? So there could be an incredibly impactful area of science that has benefited humanity, but if not 3 but 4 people, were the seminal contributors, that area might never get recognized with a Nobel Prize because it doesn't fit the mold of the one person with the one thing. So, and even when one person does receive a Nobel Prize, such as myself, it's in recognition of the work that a team of 100 people over many decades contributed to, right? And I'm the figurehead who's representing it, but I'm not the person who actually did any of the experiments behind it, right? So I think we need to acknowledge that. It would be great if a body would create a prize that was more cognizant of the team nature of science and recognize teams. And there are a few things like that, but there could be more.
I mean, I hear that, and you're not the first scientist to observe this, but it's really, I think, really important when it comes from somebody who's been as decorated as you are. I also want to talk a little bit about diversity and inclusion. You've been a very big advocate. And what do you say to colleagues who may raise concerns about the trade-off between meritocracy and inclusion?
Well, so that's a false dichotomy. So first of all, I would say that you really can't make any case that your system is a meritocracy if you don't see the diversity of human beings represented, right, in that setting. So any enterprise that has a homogeneous workforce is by definition one that is not recognizing a meritocracy, right? So let's just say that. The other thing I'll say is, were it not for some attention to diversity issues, I would not be sitting here. I would never have been given an academic job, to be honest. At the time that I was on the academic job market, I applied to some universities, and one of the universities that made me a job offer did so only after choosing first another candidate and then making the case to the university that if they would get a second hiring opportunity, they would give it to a female. Okay, And their university said, oh, all right, hey, if you're willing, to hire a female, which they hadn't done before, that was a new thing in 1994 in a lot of departments. If it hadn't been for that, I wouldn't have even received that job offer. And at the time, I was actually grateful for that, because an opportunity is an opportunity. And many women didn't have them, and I was going to have one, and I had better take it, regardless of whether I liked the idea that it was an opportunity hire,
I have two more questions for you, and then I'm going to open them to the audience, because I'm sure that folks have lots of questions. So I want to ask you a little bit about ACS Central Science. And it's just celebrated its 10th anniversary. You are editor-in-chief, and and Central Science is an open access journal. How important is that to you, actually?
So I'm a very strong advocate of open access publishing as a concept, and I was long before ACS made the commitment to enter the open access space. So the backstory of ACS Central Science, and by the way, who here has published in ACS Central Science? Uh-oh, we got a lot of work to do here. We would love to have your publication submitted to our journal. I'll just put that out there. And I'll say that I was first asked to be on the search committee for the inaugural ACS Central Science editor-in-chief. That's how I first got to know about the journal. So ACS had the idea that they wanted to get into open access, and this was going to be their entry point, to create a journal that was a high impact, very broad, interdisciplinary, kind of flagship, visible journal with something for everyone, but open access. And so there I was on the search committee, and I was with the other search committee members trying to articulate, like, what kind of person would we want to recruit? And it should be somebody who feels strongly about the journal, and I had all these opinions about it. And finally, the other search committee members said, well, since you have so many opinions about it, why don't you stand for editor-in-chief? And I thought, really? Then, the next day I thought, yeah, I think I will. And so I stepped off the committee and ended up being an applicant for the position. They hired me. What I love about open access publishing is that it is true to the stewardship of the money that we use to do research, which comes mostly from the federal government and from the taxpayers. So most of my research, and it's true for most academics, our research is funded by the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy, the National Institutes of Health. That money comes from taxpayers. And the taxpayers put their trust in science, right, when they're paying taxes, and when the Congress allocates some of that money to science, all of that is an articulation of trust, that we trust you to take this money and do things that benefit us. But then if we spend those monies and do research that the people who paid for it can't even read about, are we really being responsible stewards of their money? So I feel very strongly that if we're going to take money out of the pockets of the taxpayers to support our research, that research had better be delivered back to the taxpayers. And the way that they get access to that research is through open access publishing. Why should your next door neighbor have to pay $30 to get an article that you published that they paid for? That's how I see it.
No, and I think that's a really compelling case, actually, for open access and indeed open science more broadly, as we talked about earlier. I mean, of course, it also raises a question, though, about how we manage this with issues around protecting intellectual property and stuff like this. And you were, of course, involved in a few companies, and I'd be interested to hear your reflections on this. Managing intellectual property and also this responsibility to share the findings of the investment from public funds.
Right. Well, so in academia, it is now the case, and this is due to some actually changes in the law about 25 years ago, that when an academic researcher makes a discovery at their university, the intellectual property is owned by the university, and the academic scientists and the co-inventors of that science are inventors on the patent. So what that means is that if the students in my lab make discoveries that we think are potentially valuable, of commercial value, we can file a patent application that is owned by Stanford, but on which my students and postdocs are listed as co-inventors. Then Stanford can benefit from the potential value of this intellectual property by licensing the patent to a company. And that company could be a company that already exists in the world, Or it could be a company that I start and spin out from my lab, and then my company will license that intellectual property from Stanford. So it's a virtuous cycle because it incentivizes myself and my students to try to make the most of our intellectual property, either by starting companies or by sharing the science in a public forum like this, where someone from industry might find an interest in it. And if there is a licensing arrangement and there's some income from the patent, that money helps to support the university's research mission. And a part of those revenues will actually come back to the inventors on the patent, including myself and my students. And so I'll tell my students, if somebody's going to make money off of the work you did in your PhD thesis, I think one of those people should be you. and the intellectual property is what secures that.
I mean, so I understand it's a way of kind of maintaining a sense of control, really. And also with reinvesting, of course, in the system and so on. Okay, I'm going to stop asking you questions now and invite some members of our audience. Okay, I see we have 2 questions. So this person just here, and then come to the one front. If you say very quickly your name, that would be lovely.
Sure. Hi, Carolyn. My name is Minwei, and I'm a PhD student who's about to graduate. And I'm looking for postdocs right now, so I wonder, what are your thoughts on working for a young PI or more older and successful PIs?
Oh,
Sorry
no.
for the wording. Nothing personal.
We'll just take another question here in the front, and then, yeah.
Should I answer this one first, though?
No, just wait.
Okay.
Okay.
We have to wait.
Hi, Carolyn. I sent you some of the Banerjee here, and the Pride Chair for last year. We talked on, what is that called, Twitter. My question was, I really like how you explain the investment, mentoring as investment in student, but then I also feel like because we are expected to constantly publish and submit grant, I'm having this, I want to see my students as full human being, but also, oh my God, there is this tremendous pressure of publishing and submitting grants. So how do you, as an early career faculty, how did you manage that?
Okay. Now can I answer both? Okay. All right. So starting with question number 1, I'm of 2 minds on this one because on the one hand, I'm deeply grateful when talented postdoctoral candidates reach out to me expressing an interest in joining my lab as a postdoc. Even though I'm old, I really am very grateful and I'm happy to have them. Having said that, I always encourage people to look closely at young labs, new labs. I think that a startup lab is a really great place to get an education. You get a very special kind of training when you're helping someone set up a new lab. I did it as a grad student, so I know this firsthand. So, self-servingly, I would say, come to my lab. But I do think it's great. It's great for young professors to have talented postdocs interested in them. They really need that. It's so helpful. I had an amazing first postdoc when I was a new assistant professor, and I was so grateful that he was willing, to work for someone totally unknown like myself, And therefore, I would encourage postdocs to go and join new labs, because if that lab succeeds, and you'll be a big part of that, if the lab succeeds, you'll have some credit for that. You'll learn a lot. You'll learn a lot about what it means to be a PI, because you'll be with your advisor, like hands-on every day. You'll see the daily grind of it all, good and bad, and I think that's a very special experience. So I would encourage the new lab, but don't forget about me. And then as to your question, how do you deal with the various, sometimes seemingly adversarial pressures of being an early career scientist, where on the one hand, the clock is ticking on you. You don't want to lose your job in 6 years, and you would like to be able to get your research program off the ground and get papers published and grants funded, because that's what you need to be successful. The interesting thing is your students need the same thing. You guys are actually very much aligned with the same incentives. They also want to have their projects succeed. They also want their papers to get published. This is a really, getting a paper published is so great for your self-esteem, right? There's no greater rush than that moment your paper gets accepted someplace. And the students need you to get grants because you have to feed them, right? You have to pay for their science and for their salaries and so on. So I think all of your incentives are really pointing in the same direction, more so than people might think. Where sometimes I see the tension is when young professors feel that their students need to be in the lab 100 hours a week, but the students need to be happy and healthy and rested and thoughtful. And I think I made this mistake. When I was a young professor, and I was there every weekend at 8 a.m. on Saturday morning and looking around to an empty lab and wondering, where is everybody? I have all these ideas I need to tell you about right now, you know. And it took me a couple of years to realize that that is actually counterproductive, that students who are tired, stressed, you know, sleep deprived, have no friends, no family life, no vacation, no pets, you know, those students, they are not going to be happy. They are not going to be creative. They're not going to be productive. You know, and it's hard to acknowledge that this is actually the truth. But I can tell you again from my own experience, and I made the same mistake that young professors still make today. And there's no way anyone can ever talk you out of this, I think. But the truth is that a student who has one brilliant creative idea is much more valuable to you than a student who can crank out 100 uninteresting ideas. That's just true, right? So you might as well give your students the latitude that they need to be happy people, to have a life outside of the laboratory, because where they get that brilliant idea is probably not going to be at the bench. It's probably going to be in the forest or in the nightclub or in the tennis court, right? So let them do that. Who agrees with me? Students are like, yes.
It reminds me, there was a really lovely moment when you got your Nobel Prize and you shout out to the students, and you're like, students, y'all. It was really lovely to hear it.
Well, my students were there, and I was looking right at them. And they were like not looking at me, they were texting. And I was like, hello. And they were like, you're not the boss of us anymore. All right.
I mean, but it also reminds me of something that you were saying, you know, it's kind of like you feel like you're, you know, cultivating these people who are in many ways not exactly clones, but they're like, you know, very much taking on your learning and stuff, and then they go off into the big wide world and they do their own thing. It's a lovely image. So we have two more questions. Just this guy here.
Hello, Caroline. My name is Ridwan. I'm from Nigeria. So you have told your story about how you were in a new lab and how everything rolled out, become a professor and so on. So my question is, as a PhD student or say candidate who is graduating soon, during your time, how did you know, okay, I am supposed to be a professor? Were there specific identifiers for you to go to university or go do a industrial postdoc or something? I just want to know, what are those things to look out for? Does it just happen naturally, or there are specific identifiers that you follow that guides you to this point? Congratulations.
Thank you. It's a great question. I didn't really have a plan for my career after training. Not when I was in grad school, and not really so much as a postdoc either, to be honest. I wasn't a very long-term thinker that way. It was more about like, what right now am I interested in doing? And at the time, I had a two-body situation in the San Francisco Bay Area. I had a partner who already had a job and was kind of a career. And so I knew that if this relationship was going to have any longevity, I would have to find a job in the Bay Area. And so that's limiting. And a person really can't assume they'll find an academic job in one city. You know, sometimes you need to be a little bit more flexible geographically. So I think in my head, you know, I thought, as long as I'm in a job with people who are nice and smart and motivated and funny, you know, where every day you can come to work and enjoy the science and the people, then I could be happy. And that could be in a biotech company, it could have been in a teaching college or a community college or an R1 university, which is where I ended up. But I think I could have been happy in a lot of different jobs, as long as the people were like motivated and smart and nice, you know.
I'm going to ask you a follow-up question. So we're taking a question over there, actually, Sarah. While you make it over there, I'm going to ask a question that's quite a nice follow-up to what you just said, which came from our audience online. And it says, when you were a young scientist, specifically during your PhD, with a dream of doing something great, how did you manage failures and stresses and get over them to work with new hope and enthusiasm?
I wish all of that were true. You know, well, first of all, I never had the plans of doing something great, quote unquote. It was more like I had the plan of trying to get my next experiment to work, or at least to give me a clear answer to a question. Again, I was not a big thinker, long-term thinker. Much more, like if someone had asked me, what do you want to do with your life? I would have said, I want to get that reaction yield up above 80%. Like that was my life, you know. So there's that to be honest about. And you know, what did they say after that? It was.
And how did you manage failures and stresses and get over them and work with new hope and enthusiasm?
My failures came pretty early and pretty hard. So my projects didn't work. My first several projects didn't work at all. It took me 3 years to kind of finally get on something I thought I could make a thesis out of. I published papers as a grad student, but 3/4 of them were rejected from the first journal I submitted to, and sometimes the second or third. So most of my papers were rejected. Most of my projects didn't work. My boss quit. And, you know, I just thought, well, this is how it is in science. You know, you just get up the next day and go to work and try again, you know. I didn't really have a lot of success until kind of later on, you know. And then it was like, wow, I didn't know you could have a paper accepted from the first journal you sent it to. What? You know, don't they know it hasn't been rejected yet? So, you know, maybe my expectations were set accordingly so that everything after that felt really amazing, you know. But I do think that failure is a term that we use a little too loosely, because people, you know, when experiments don't go as you hope, you call it a failure, right? When the reaction doesn't give you the product you want, it's a failure, right? When the data are inscrutable, it's a failure, right? When your hypothesis turns out to be wrong, you call it a failure. None of those things are failures. They're just experiments that didn't go as you thought they should. They give you a different answer, and then you have to follow the data, and it might take you to an unexpected place. A failure is really only when you do a poorly thought out experiment. You know, if you do a bad experiment and you learn nothing, that's a failure. But other things are not failures. People say they are, but they're not. And if you don't believe me, you might wonder, how did Barry Sharpless's lab and Morton Meldau's lab come up with this copper-catalyzed azide alkyne cycloaddition? Failures. So Morton's grad student was trying to do a different reaction, and instead of getting the product he was trying to get, he ended up getting this triazole. And he was like, that's not what I wanted. What's up with that, you know? And then he scratched his head and said, how did that even happen? And went down a rabbit hole that led to a Nobel Prize. But that started out as a failure.
I mean, I think that's...
Which isn't to say that all the reactions that don't work are going to get you a Nobel Prize. Just to be clear.
You know, it reminds me, Elizabeth Posen, I think, has a podcast series called How to Fail, which is effectively interviewing people who become very successful, asking them, so what were the failures that were so key to your success? And it's a brilliant concept, actually. Okay, we have a question here.
Hi, Caroline. My name is Anika Chaudhary. I'm a sophomore undergrad at Bowdoin College in the Doobie Lab. So this is a science education question. As you alluded to before, you put a lot of importance to open access publications so taxpayers can benefit from the information. However, I don't think much of the public uses Google Scholar or SciFinder as opposed to Google. So do you think scientists have any responsibility towards science communication to diverse non-scientific audiences to better disseminate the knowledge that we create?
Well, yes, absolutely. That's a very insightful comment that you just made, coming from a scientific granddaughter of sorts. I'm very proud. So Danielle Doobie was one of my grad students. So thank you for working in her lab. That's great. Yes, we do have a responsibility to communicate science to people who don't have, you know, PhDs in chemistry. That's absolutely true. And most of us are not that great at it. And I'd say most of us, it's hard for us to find the venue in which to connect with the general public. Because even, you know, here in ACS meetings, there's a lot of people here whose career is focused on scientific communication. Here's one of them right here, scientific reporting. But, you know, as much as the public doesn't use Google Scholar or PubMed or read ACS Central Science, even though they could, they also probably don't read C&E News and other, you know, adjacent periodicals that are targeted for a more general audience, but not accessible to the general public. So how do you reach the public nowadays? You know, you reach them on TikTok, you reach them on YouTube, and maybe Twitter if they're a little older. You generally don't reach them in scientific publishing venues. So I think having access to the tools and having a means to reach out to the public with messages of science is really important.
Thank you. Okay, a couple more questions. This lady here and over here. Yeah.
Hi, Caroline. My name is Marilyn, and I'm a research scientist at Dow Chemical. And my question is, do you have any advice on how to make disruptive science?
Disruptive science. Oh my gosh. The funny thing is, we can all point to things that we think are disruptive science, right? Every discipline has those things. But if you then trace back historically, most of those things were serendipity, discoveries on the outskirts of a field, and sometimes the disruptive science was there for a long time, but unnoticed, unrecognized, and unappreciated, right? Because it was before its time to disrupt or whatever. So it's funny because what makes science, a scientific breakthrough disruptive is a combination of where the field is at that moment, the timing of things, having people be receptive to it when previously they might not have been. A lot of it is really in the sort of the psychology, in the sort of the social elements of science, more so than the actual technical breakthrough itself, So I think maybe the best thing you can do, I don't think you can plan to be disruptive. I really don't think that's a planned out thing. I think what you can do is try and stretch outside the boundaries of your discipline, try to find the connections with other things that other people might not have noticed, and try to make discoveries at interfaces. And maybe you'll disrupt and maybe you won't. But I don't know that you can set out on that path. Yeah.
Okay, there's a question over here. Sure. In fact, while you're doing that, I'm going to ask you about a quote that I read. It says, the headwinds that come with being in a field that's underappreciated are substantial. On reflection, how did you navigate those headwinds to rise to the top of your field, not only your field, but across chemistry?
Well, so what I was referring to in that statement about headwinds is about the particular area of biology that I work in, which is called glycobiology. And that's studying the biology of complex carbohydrates. And, the funny thing is there was a time when that area of biochemistry was not considered like a niche outside the mainstream. And this takes us back to the 1960s, 1970s, the period of time during which people started to understand the fundamentals of metabolism, right? So Melvin Calvin, discovered the Calvin cycle and like the tricarboxylic acid cycle and gluconeogenesis and glycolysis. Those were sort of like the first practitioners of glycoscience. And that work was considered like cutting edge, and Nobel Prizes were given. And then what happened was the 1970s came along, and it was the molecular biology revolution. And suddenly, because of recombinant DNA technology and people's understanding of the central dogma, which is how we describe the information flow from DNA to RNA to proteins, and people figured out how to manipulate that central dogma, that became so empowering, and it made biological research focused on those molecules so much more facile. Naturally, people gravitated. People want to work in a field where there's tools and you can make progress and things happen quickly and it's instant gratification. And so other areas of biology that remained still a little bit more labor intensive because they were not direct beneficiaries of molecular biology, those areas started to drift off into the sideline. And that's when glycoscience became considered more niche. And so because that sort of nicheification, I'd say, is that a word? I don't know.
I think it should be.
The nicheification of glycoscience happened, again, in the 1970s, early 80s. And, that was long enough ago that the generation of scientists who were trained in glycoscience have now moved on. And the new generation of scientists, such as myself, who became a PhD student in the 80s, right? People my age or thereabouts don't know much about glycoscience. Unless you happen to be like me, someone who worked in the field, but that's a minority of people. So that just means that the general education of glycoscience is much less now than it used to be in an earlier generation. And if people don't learn a subject when they're young, it's much harder to teach it to them when they're old, like a language, right? Same phenomenon. So that's the headwind.
Okay. And I guess actually this is something that, as you say, is not going to be unique to glycoscience, but it's a kind of a dynamic, a pattern that you'll see over and over again. Okay, so you've been very patient.
Hi, Carolyn. My name is Ava Maria. I'm a PhD student right now, and my question's regarding networking. I come from a smaller university that isn't as well known as somewhere you are currently at, and so how would a student like me who is asking researchers to come and visit our university and talk to us about the incredible research they're doing, go about networking with some of these bigger names and seeing if they might want to come and talk to some students like us?
Well, that's a great question. One thing you can do is go to ACS meetings, and if there's a fireside chat, you can come and ask questions like this, microphone. What college are you from? George Mason. It's not exactly a little off the grid. Just, okay. Yes, and so I would say, well, first of all, most of your networking will probably happen outside of your university, even if you're at Stanford. I mean, that's the truth. I send my students to conferences as often as I can afford to, because I do think that's a great environment in which to meet people, especially if you have a poster at a poster session. Having said that, ACS meetings are so big that you can stand at your poster session all night and not find the person you're looking for. People are so connected nowadays that I think you can probably network online with people who are in adjacent fields to yours or who you'd like to get to know. I'm on Twitter, for example, and I follow a lot of students. So most of the people I follow on Twitter are trainees. They're grad students and postdocs, and then eventually they have jobs, but I started following them when they were students. And the reason I did that is probably because they tweeted something and tagged me. And I'm like, oh, that person sounds like they're doing something kind of interesting, and I'd like to learn more about their science, and I'll start following them. And then sometimes they start DMing me, and we end up with sort of conversations about an experiment they're doing. Or so that's one way to do it, Not everybody is on Twitter, not everybody is on Instagram, whatever you're following, but otherwise, I think also, like, if you have the opportunity to publish your work, which I know at undergraduate institutions is maybe a little bit more complicated because you're not a full-time researcher, you're doing this part-time and so on. But if you do get the opportunity to publish your work, that's really great too, especially if you publish in ACS journals, because some of the HGS journals have these sort of auxiliary things that, like, you can do a little webinar on your science and have it be linked to the article and things like that. That's another way to get a little bit more visibility for your work and form connections with people who read your paper.
Okay, so we have two more questions here. We're going to take them because we're coming to the last few minutes, and I'd like to get one more question in. So we'll have, here, and then the lady in the mask back there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Emily. I am an undergraduate. I'm a senior at Villanova University and a first-year master's student there. I'm currently considering applying for PhD programs, and I was just wondering if you had any advice for undergraduates who are considering pursuing higher education, what are some valuable qualities to have or important things to consider before you decide to apply for higher education?
Well, first of all, that's great that you're thinking of applying to a PhD program, and hopefully you'll apply to Stanford. I'd love to see your application come in.
I'd love to get in.
Well, so the thing is, I think a PhD is the wonderful thing about a PhD degree is that it opens a lot of doors for you professionally, both in science and in science adjacent areas. The most important thing you learn as a PhD student is how to solve problems. How to synthesize information, how to organize information, how to identify problems, and then how to solve them. And the specifics of the problem you happen to solve as a PhD student is sort of less important than just going through the exercise of learning how to do that. And for those of you who are later stage grad students, you might not realize how good you've become at identifying problems, synthesizing information, and proposing solutions until you go on to the next job and you realize how much quicker it happens the second time, right? It feels like it takes a while to really get that skill under control as a grad student, but it just gets quicker and quicker each time you do it again. So I do think there's a lot of value in a PhD program. And because you don't have to take out loans and pay for yourself, you won't leave grad school in debt. That also leaves you with a lot of opportunities job-wise. You don't have to worry about med school loans or law school loans, right? So I'm a big fan, obviously, of the PhD degree. It's a huge value add.
It's just a word of thanks, Carolyn. It's Nancy Williams.
Hello.
I came out as queer in 2013, and when I talk to people who came out in the 2000s and the early 20-teens, the vast majority of people I've talked to have a Carolyn Bertozzi story. And it goes something like this. If I come out, am I going to lose my career in chemistry? And we almost had some mentor tell us, well, Carolyn Bertozzi's out there and she's rocking it, so you'll probably be okay. So now I get to go to these Pride receptions and see hundreds of out queer chemists. The seeds that you've planted are many, so thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that, Nancy. Coming from you, that means a lot, given the impact that you've had. And we know each other well, for many years now. So you came out as queer in 2013. So you're like in puberty, man. Because I came out as queer in like 1985 or something like that. So I'm old as you know what. And the thing is, I came out at a time when it was right in the heart of the AIDS crisis, right? 1986 through 1990. The death toll just was exponential. And when I was looking for PhD programs, I quite specifically targeted universities in the San Francisco Bay Area because it was an epicenter of gay rights activism at a time when our lives depended on it, right? And I was very much involved in that as an undergraduate, and I couldn't really pull that train back into the station as a grad student, right? So, once I went to Berkeley in full gear, full queer gear, as you can imagine, there was no walking that back, So I never had the sort of internal conflict of whether I should be out or not. It was too late for me. I was out, And it was a blessing because I do think that is a tortuous internal conversation that people have. I understand the conflict. Being out brings risks. It's very risky to be out, even today. It can be risky in micro ways, maybe you get overlooked or denigrated in subtle microaggression kind of ways. But in some geographies, it's truly a physical risk, like to your life, right? Where you're criminalized in your society. So it is no small decision ever to be out at work or in the community at large. And everybody, who takes that step of being out is committing an act of bravery at all levels. And I'm very grateful that I think I just entered into adulthood at a time when a gay person, could have a more optimistic view of their future, So I was very lucky in my timing.
Thank you, Caroline. In the last few moments, I want us to look to the future. What do you see as some of the biggest challenges? In fact, you may say there are opportunities, let's not be negative, that face scientific publishing in particular.
Scientific publishing. Wow, well, it has evolved so much just in the last decade, since I became involved in ACS Central Science. And I think, of course, the biggest sort of revolution in scientific publishing, which I think is an inevitable consequence of the World Wide Web, having publications be now, electronic and internet-based, is this idea of open science, open publishing, open access. On the one hand, it's disruptive, because most publishing houses have a business model that's predicated on their subscription revenue, right? And if we're suddenly trying to shift the economics of publishing where instead of having universities or companies pay for these blanket subscriptions, you have individual authors of papers paying page charges to publish their work. That's a totally different business model that requires a big reallocation of resources. Because if I'm going to publish open access, which I think is very important for the world, I have to figure out how to pay for it myself out of my own research budget. Right now, my university is paying for access through my university's subscriptions. But if they're going to stop paying for subscriptions and I have to pick up the cost as an individual, who's going to support me? Would it be my NIH grants? So the money has to come from somewhere. And I think right now, a lot of the tension as academic publishing goes through this metamorphosis, it is around who pays, where does the money come from, who allocates it, and to whom. And so we have to figure that out, and if we don't, I don't know. Right?
Do you have any ideas?
This is your job, man. I stay in my lane.
I just reported.
No, I mean, put it this way. Funding agencies have a lot of control and influence, right? So the National Institutes of Health, they fund my research. If they make that funding contingent on publishing open access, for example, now I'm going to have to publish open access. I just have no choice, right? And so I think agencies that support research have to apply pressure on the system, because otherwise all the power is held by the publishing houses. And with all due respect to ACS, right, ACS might have a different incentive than the NIH and that I have, because ACS has to, it has to be a revenue generating organization, even though it's nonprofit. And the revenue ACS generates is deployed to good use. It supports conferences like this for subsidized registration fees for students. Right? So great things happen with that revenue, but it disincentivizes open access publishing, right? So I don't know.
Caroline, we're going to have to wrap up actually in a minute, but Caroline is she's already very generously signed some copies of the current issue of C&EN, on which she's the cover, and there's a great feature piece on her and her career. And she will also be here to sign a few more copies for about 15, 20 minutes. But I want to give you the opportunity, because I was thinking, we were just, as we were coming here, we were talking about, the attention that you get at these events, and, folks will always want to talk to you. Is there ever a question that you think, why has nobody ever asked me this question? And you would love to be able to answer something about this? Anything that you think, oh, nobody ever thinks to ask me this?
Well, you might be curious as to if I'm giving any science talks this week.
Yeah?
And I am today at 3:05 p.m. in the carb division. So
Okay.
you can ask me that.
Caroline, it's really been such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming, everybody. And for the questions, too.